What would you do if four 6-year-old girls walked up to you at a black tie gala, put $5 on the table, and asked you to be their father for the night? That is exactly what happened to Ethan Walker. He was a maintenance worker. He had a name badge that displayed his job title instead of his name.
Good
a cold
heavens,
cup of tea
Emma.
he couldn't afford to
Where did you
replace,
get all this
and calluses on
cash?
both hands from the chandeliers he had spent
look what
last
else I
Tuesday
found.
hanging in that very room.
Ethan,
Not one
we were
person at that
wondering if
gala
you
had
would be
looked
our
up long
dad
enough to
tonight.
notice.
Of
His
course
hands,
I will.
wide and calloused, the same hands that had hung those chandeliers last Tuesday, tightened around the cold cup like it was the only solid thing left in the room. And then 4 little girls did. They told him they had been watching the room for 11 minutes. They told him he was the only one who wasn't pretending. They unzipped a small coin purse and emptied everything inside onto the table. $5 bills, 3 quarters, and a yellow button with an anchor on it. They said, "We don't know what fathers cost. We've never had one at a party before." What Ethan didn't know yet was who their mother was, what she had been carrying, and what was about to happen when the wrong man, in a very expensive suit, decided that a maintenance worker sitting at the wrong table needed to be reminded of his place. Stay with me, because the moment those 4 girls chose him out of an entire room full of people was only the beginning. He almost didn't hear them. The quartet appeared from somewhere between the dessert table and a column wrapped in white ribbon. 4 identical faces arranged in a perfectly synchronized line. 6 years old, maybe. Dark hair, dark eyes, matching navy dresses with sashes that had started the evening tied in perfect bows and were now doing their best impression of surrender. They stopped in front of his table, all 4 of them. Ethan looked up from the cold tea. The one on the far left spoke first, which he would later learn was always the way it worked. Emma, though he didn't know her name yet, had the particular expression of a child who had thought something through very carefully and was now fully committed. "We've been watching you for 11 minutes, she said. Ethan set the cup down. "Okay. We picked you on purpose. This came from the second one, Grace." She said it the way a scientist announces a conclusion. "We looked at everyone in the room." "Everyone," the third confirmed. "Charlotte." She held a small coin purse against her chest with both hands. "And you're the only one who wasn't pretending," said the fourth, Sophie. She had a smear of chocolate on her left wrist and didn't seem to know it. Sophie's eyes dropped to Ethan's right hand, the small scar running along the side, and she gave the tiniest nod, like she had just confirmed something important. Ethan glanced around. No parent was visible, no nanny was rushing toward him with an apologetic smile. Just the 4 of them, steady as a wall. "Pretending to what?" he asked. Emma tilted her head. "Pretending to be happy." He had no answer for that. He opened his mouth and closed it again, which Emma seemed to take as confirmation of her analysis. Charlotte stepped forward and placed the coin purse on the table between them. It made a small, serious sound against the linen. "We would like to hire you," she said, "to be our father tonight." Ethan stared at the coin purse. "For how much?" he asked, because he genuinely could not think of another question. Grace unzipped it with great ceremony and tipped the contents onto the cloth. $5 bills, 3 quarters, and a button. "We didn't know what fathers cost," Sophie admitted. "We've never had one at a party before." The button was yellow. It had a small anchor on it. Ethan picked it up. It was lighter than he expected. He looked at the 4 faces watching him. The chandeliers he had hung were still up there. The laughter was still moving around the perimeter. But right there, at that corner table, the world had become very quiet, very strange, and somehow, impossibly, very honest. "What would I have to do?" he asked. Emma smiled. It was the smile of someone who had already planned the next 3 steps. "Just sit with us," she said. "And if anyone asks, you're ours." What Ethan didn't know yet was who their mother was and what she was walking toward. Emma did most of the talking, which seemed to be a constitutional arrangement the 4 of them had settled on long ago. She explained the situation with the precision of a child who had spent considerable time listening to adults speak and had decided she could do it better. "Our mother has an event, an important one. She's been at these events before, and she always comes back with the same face, the one that means she talked to many people and felt completely alone." "She doesn't like parties," Grace said. "She likes working," Charlotte clarified. "She doesn't know how to stop," Sophie added. Ethan listened. His thumb moved slowly across the scar on the back of his right hand, an old habit he fell into whenever he was thinking hard about something. The coin purse sat between them, $5, some change, and a button with an anchor on it. Your dad, he said carefully. He's not. He left, Emma said. There was no particular weight to it, just information. When we were 2, he said 4 was too many. Silence. Short and absolute. 4 was too many, Ethan repeated very quietly. He thought of Noah's tiny hand gripping his shirt the night Emma Carter didn't come home. 4 had never felt like too many to him. It had only ever felt like not enough. That's what he said, Emma confirmed. He thought about the weeks after the accident, when everything was paperwork and casseroles from neighbors, and a grief that sat on his chest like a physical object. One person, his brother-in-law, had said just once, quietly, that he didn't know how Ethan was going to manage. He'd said it like the math didn't add up. He'd said it like Noah was a problem to be solved instead of a person to be loved. I have a son, Ethan said. He's 5. His name is Noah. The 4 faces recalibrated instantly. Where is he? Charlotte asked. Home. Asleep, hopefully. My neighbor watches him when I work evenings. What does he look like? Sophie asked. Like a tornado, Ethan said. Who learned how to apologize. Grace made a sound that was almost a laugh and then covered it with her hand. Ethan looked at the $5 bills. He thought about what it cost a 6-year-old to save this much, to count it out, to decide this was the right use of it. He thought about the planning that must have gone into this. 4 of them in matching navy dresses, watching the room for 11 minutes, deciding on him. He pushed the money back toward them. Keep it, he said. But we need to pay you, Emma said. Otherwise it isn't real. Then consider it a trade, Ethan replied. I'll sit with you, and you sit with me. A pause. Deal? Emma looked at the other 3. Something passed between them, some signal traveling on a frequency adults couldn't quite catch. Deal, she said. The coin purse stayed on the table between them. Ethan turned the button over once in his palm and set it down. Then Charlotte said, in the careful tone of a child who had been thinking about a question for a while and had finally decided to ask it, Does Noah know his mom is gone? The table went quiet in a different way than before. Yes, Ethan said. Does he ask about her? Every day for the first year, Ethan answered. Less now, but still. Charlotte thought about that. What do you say? Ethan looked at the button. Anchor. Yellow. Lighter than it should have been. I tell him she had to go somewhere we can't follow yet, he said, and that she left us both something to carry for her. Grace tilted her head. What did she leave you? He was quiet for a moment. Noah. And what did she leave Noah? Me. Grace absorbed that with the seriousness it deserved. Sophie was looking at her own hands. Emma hadn't moved. That's a good answer, Charlotte finally said. I've had 3 years to work on it, Ethan replied. He said it without self-pity, just the plain fact of time and repetition. The way a man says something he has repeated so many times it no longer costs him as much to say, even though it still costs him something. He didn't know what he was agreeing to. He didn't know that the woman in the deep red dress who was crossing the room at that very moment, searching for 4 familiar faces in a crowd that had grown too loud and too bright and too much, was about to change everything. He picked up his cold tea, took a sip, and made a face. Sophie noticed immediately. Is it bad? It's terrible, he said honestly. She nodded, satisfied, as though that too was the correct answer. What happened next would catch all of them off guard, especially Victoria Bennett, who had spent 4 years teaching herself not to be caught off guard by anything. She saw the navy dresses first, all 4 of them, gathered around a corner table she hadn't noticed earlier because the table had a maintenance badge sitting beside the floral centerpiece, and Victoria Bennett had trained herself over years of events like this one to look past certain things. Then she recalibrated. Her daughters were sitting with a man she didn't recognize. He was leaning forward slightly, elbows on the table, talking to Sophie, who was gesturing with both hands about something that appeared extremely important. The man's jacket was off. His sleeves were rolled to his forearms. His hands, when they rested on the table, were the hands of someone who worked with them. Victoria crossed the room with the particular speed of a mother who was not panicking but would very much like everyone to understand that she was close. Girls. 4 heads turned. 4 faces instantly became far too innocent. The man looked up. Victoria had expected many things in her 11 years of navigating rooms like that one. She had not expected brown eyes that widened slightly and then carefully settled into neutrality, like someone who had just realized he'd been caught doing something kind and wasn't entirely sure whether that was allowed. Miss Bennett. He stood, not with the polished rise of someone performing deference, just up, present, a little unsure. She looked at the coin purse on the table, then at him, then at Emma, who wore the expression of someone preparing to explain a perfectly reasonable decision to a person who might not immediately recognize its reasonableness. "Mom," Emma said, "this is our father." The room did not stop. Laughter continued in its orbit, but in the small radius around that corner table, something held its breath. "He agreed to a trade," Grace added helpfully. Victoria looked at the man. He wasn't apologizing, which she noticed. He also wasn't smiling, which she noticed too. He was simply standing there with a maintenance badge, rolled-up sleeves, and eyes that carried the particular stillness of someone who had learned how to remain calm in difficult situations. "I'm Ethan Walker," he said. "I work here, building maintenance." A pause. "I think your daughters may have run a more sophisticated operation than I realized when I agreed to it." Victoria looked at Emma again. Emma looked right back, entirely unrepentant. "Are you angry?" Sophie asked Victoria. Her voice had dropped into the register she used whenever she genuinely didn't know the answer. Victoria set her clutch on the table and sat down beside Sophie, which was not what she had intended to do. She had intended to apologize to the man, collect the girls, and return to the endless circuit of conversations she was supposed to be having, but Sophie had asked the question in that voice. "No," Victoria said. "I'm not angry." She picked up the coin purse and looked inside. Then she looked at Ethan. "You were going to sit with them for $5? She asked. "I was going to sit with them for free," Ethan replied. "The $5 was their idea. I didn't want to take that away from them." Victoria's fingers tightened once around the coin purse before she set it back down. Her thumb brushed the smooth skin on her left wrist, where a ring had once been. The same unconscious motion she had made for 4 years whenever she felt a room closing in around her. She looked at the table instead of at him. She was used to reading people for a living. She wasn't used to being the one worth reading. "Sit down," she said. Not an order, more like a door opening. Victoria sat down. Ethan sat too. He picked up the terrible tea again. Across the room, a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit noticed them and paused in the middle of a conversation. His eyes settled on the corner table with the particular focus of someone cataloging information for later use. Jonathan Pierce, former fiancé, current board member. The kind of man who called himself a friend while keeping score in a ledger no one else was allowed to see. He smiled and started walking toward them. Pay attention to what he says, because Jonathan had spent years learning that the most effective wounds are the ones disguised as concern. Jonathan arrived like someone who had practiced arriving. He touched Victoria's shoulder briefly as he came to a stop beside the table, familiar enough to establish territory, light enough to deny it if challenged. "Victoria." The warmth in his voice was the kind that took years to perfect. "I've been looking for you. The Harmon Group keeps asking about you specifically, and I've been doing my best to hold the fort, but honestly, there's only so much I can do without you in the room." He made it sound like concern. He made it sound like she was needed. Then he looked at Ethan, and his expression performed something very practiced. It didn't change at all. "I don't think we've met," Jonathan said with the open, generous smile of a man who was absolutely certain of his own place in every room he entered. "Ethan Walker," Ethan replied. He did not stand. "Jonathan Pierce." He let the name settle, then tilted his chin very slightly toward the maintenance badge. The movement was so small it could have been accidental. "Are you with the venue team? I thought the staff briefing was supposed to keep everyone at their stations during the event. I can check with the coordinator if there's been some confusion regarding scheduling." He delivered it the way a doctor delivers difficult news, regretful, helpful, blameless. "No confusion," Victoria said. Of course." Jonathan lifted both hands, open, conceding nothing. "I only ask because I care about how the foundation is perceived tonight. These events set a tone, and the Harmon Group in particular responds to." He paused, selecting the word with the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was selecting. Context. He looked at Victoria with an expression of private concern, the look of someone sharing a confidence between old friends. "I just want to make sure we're protecting what you've built. You've worked so hard for this, Victoria. I'd hate for anything to distract from that." Charlotte quietly put down her dessert fork. Sophie shifted closer to Ethan's arm. Ethan said nothing. He placed the teacup down with one careful motion and looked at the tablecloth. His jaw settled into the particular stillness of someone who had stood in rooms like this before, who had learned that the words available to him were rarely the right ones, and who had stopped reaching for them a long time ago. Jonathan turned back toward Victoria with a small, warm smile. "I'll tell them you'll be over in just a moment." Then he left with the effortless confidence of a man certain he had helped. The table held its silence. Then Grace said, "I don't like him." "Grace," Victoria warned gently. "He was being mean," Grace said without heat, without drama, simply stating what she had observed. "He just did it with a nice face." Ethan's eyes moved toward Grace. He remained quiet for a moment. "Smart kid," he finally said. Victoria studied her daughters, then him. "I should go speak with the Harmons," she said. She directed it toward Ethan, not the girls. An explanation, not an exit. "We know," Emma replied. "We'll stay with Ethan." Victoria stood, then stopped. Her eyes had landed on the button with the anchor resting beside the teacup. "Where did that come from?" she asked. "My jacket," Ethan replied. "It fell off last week. I just haven't gotten around to sewing it back on." Victoria picked it up and slipped it into her clutch without explanation. Then she walked toward the Harmon group. Ethan watched her go. "She took your button," Sophie observed. "I noticed," he said. What he didn't know yet was why she'd taken it, what she'd been thinking since the moment she sat down, or what she'd seen in him that an entire room full of expensive suits had walked past without noticing. Then, 20 feet away, Sophie started to cry. Not the kind of crying children perform for attention, the real kind. The quiet kind that begins somewhere deep and escapes before the child even realizes it's happening. Ethan was moving before he thought about it. He didn't kneel beside her. He knelt directly in front of her, at eye level, exactly the way he did every night when Noah woke up crying for a mother who wasn't there. Around them, the party continued its orbit dress shoes, silk gowns, conversations, laughter. The room was full of adults standing at full height, navigating the world from somewhere above a 6-year-old's eye level. Ethan was the only one on the floor. "Hey," he said softly. Sophie shook her head. Her hands were clenched into fists. "It's okay," Ethan said. "I don't want it to be okay," she answered. The honesty of it made Emma reach over and gently take her sister's fist into her own hand. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, creased from spending too long inside a work jacket. Without unfolding it, he held it out to Sophie. She looked at it. "What is it?" "A story," he said. "Noah makes me carry one in case he gets sad somewhere that's not home. He dictates them. I write them down." Sophie unfolded the paper. Her fingers were still shaking. The other 3 girls leaned closer. Ethan remained where he was, eye level, waiting. Across the room, Victoria Bennett turned her head in the middle of a conversation. She saw him crouched in front of her daughter. She saw the folded paper. She saw Sophie's face slowly change from the expression of someone swallowing something painful to the expression of someone who had just been handed a small rope to hold on to. Victoria excused herself and started walking back. Slowly. She didn't want to interrupt. She stopped 10 feet away and watched Ethan read the story in a low voice, angling the paper toward the candlelight. She watched him pause at the funny parts. She watched him wait, not rushing, giving Sophie room to find her own way back. And for the first time that evening, Victoria Bennett understood exactly why her daughters had chosen him. Victoria's breath caught. In that moment, she understood. This was the kind of father her daughters had never had, the kind who stayed on the floor until the tears stopped, and she noticed his hands. She had seen them before the calluses, the small scar on the right hand, but now she was close enough to see that his left hand rested lightly on Sophie's knee. Not controlling, not directing, just present. Just steady. The way you brace something that's still finding its balance. A man who knew how to do that did not learn it from nowhere. She thought about the way her ex-husband had held the girls. Correctly. Performed perfectly. The right gesture at the right social moment. For 2 years she had told herself she was imagining the difference. She wasn't imagining the difference. Sophie laughed. A small sound. Real. Ethan folded the paper back up and handed it to her. "Keep it," he said. "In case you need a rope somewhere that's not home." Sophie looked at the paper for a moment and then looked up at him. "Did you lose someone?" Children have absolutely no reason to be that direct, and somehow they always are. "My wife," Ethan said. 3 years ago, the 4 girls became still. Not awkwardly still. The particular stillness children have when they're absorbing something true. "Do you still miss her?" Charlotte asked. "Every morning," Ethan answered. "But Noah and I have a deal. We're allowed to miss her and still have a good day. Both things can be true." Victoria pressed 2 fingers against her left wrist where the ring had once been. She had never told her daughters about a deal like that. She had never thought to give them one. She had spent so much time making sure they were okay that she had forgotten to give them language for the moments when they weren't okay. This man who cost $5 and a yellow anchor button had just handed her daughter a rope. Victoria's hand moved flat against her sternum. She didn't realize she'd done it until she'd been standing that way for almost a full minute. But what happened next wasn't quiet. Because Jonathan Pierce was watching from across the room, and Jonathan had just made a decision he would regret. Before that night, Ethan and Victoria had each been alone in the same way. Not the dramatic kind of alone, the quiet, functional kind. The kind you stop noticing because you've organized your entire life around it. 3 years earlier, on a Tuesday in February, Ethan had sat on the kitchen floor at 2 in the morning with a stuffed elephant in his lap and a needle threaded with gray wool. The ear had come off at the seam. Clean. The way things finally give up after enough handling. Noah was asleep down the hall. The hospital paperwork still sat on the table. He hadn't moved it yet. He wasn't particularly skilled at sewing. His stitches were uneven, too large in some places, too tight in others. The kind of work that holds but doesn't look impressive. He did it anyway. He tied the final knot, bit through the thread, and held the elephant up beneath the kitchen light. It would do. He placed it beside the paperwork and went to wash his hands. The water ran cold for a long time before it warmed. 4 years earlier, in a different city, Victoria had sat in a conference room at 11 o'clock at night reading a contract she had already reviewed twice. Jonathan had called that afternoon to tell her he'd spoken with the Harmon Group on her behalf, just to smooth things over, just to make sure they understood the constraints she was working under. He had said it gently. He had said it like he was helping. She hadn't known how to name what it was back then. She had thought maybe he was right. Maybe she wasn't managing well enough. Maybe 4 daughters, a company, and a divorce were too many variables. Maybe the problem was the math. She had gone back to the contract. Outside the window, the city had continued on its own schedule. Taxis, late buses, someone walking a dog through the rain, the ordinary persistence of things that didn't know they were supposed to stop. She hadn't cried. She had simply made a note in the margin, closed the laptop, and gone upstairs to check on the girls, all 4 of them asleep across 2 beds. A familiar tangle of small bodies she had learned to navigate in the dark without waking anyone. She had stood in the doorway for a moment, just stood there. Then she had gone to bed. 2 people, 2 rooms. The same particular weight of carrying an entire life alone during the hours when no one was watching. Neither of them knew then that eventually someone would see. Jonathan timed it perfectly. He always did. He waited until a cluster of board members drifted near the entrance, the sort of people whose presence shaped stories afterward. People who would remember what they saw and repeat it to people who mattered. Then he crossed toward the corner table. He didn't sit. He stood slightly to the left of Ethan's chair, close enough that his shadow fell across the table, across the $5 bills, across the coin purse, and across Ethan's hands. One hand settled on the back of the empty chair beside him, not touching, just occupying space, cutting the sightline between Ethan and the girls with the practiced ease of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and would deny it effortlessly. "I owe you an apology," Jonathan said. Warmly, carefully, Ethan looked up. "I came across as dismissive earlier, and that wasn't fair." Jonathan's voice was low and private, the tone of a genuine confidence shared between 2 men. "I get protective of Victoria. Old habit. We go back a long way, and I've watched a lot of people try to get close to her for the wrong reasons." He glanced toward the coin purse and then back at Ethan. "I'm sure you understand. A woman in her position, with 4 children, attracts a certain kind of attention. I just want to make sure she's protected. I'm sure you'd want the same thing." He was good. Ethan had to give him that. In one smooth conversation, Jonathan had managed to apologize, imply that Ethan had hidden motives, invoke Victoria's vulnerability, and make it sound like they were allies. Emma's eyes moved to Ethan's face, waiting to see what he would do. Grace became very still. Charlotte's hand found Sophie's beneath the table. "I think," Ethan said carefully, "you should probably go." Jonathan's smile never moved. "Of course, I just wanted to clear the air." He straightened his jacket and prepared to leave. Then, a voice stopped him. "Jonathan." Victoria Bennett stood 6 feet away. Her voice was level, her red dress completely still. Jonathan turned with a smile already arranged. "I'm sorry?" Victoria took one step forward. "How long have you been doing that?" The smile paused, just slightly, and for the first time that night, Jonathan Pierce looked surprised. "How long have you been doing that?" Victoria asked. "Not really a question. Managing people on my behalf, having the helpful conversation, making sure everyone understands the appropriate context." She took another step toward him. "Did you speak to Daniel Foster that way? In December, when he stopped calling?" Jonathan's smile recalibrated slightly. "Victoria, I was only, and the Delancey partnership last spring. You told them I was overwhelmed. You told them the girls made it difficult for me to commit to anything long-term. The board members near the entrance were no longer looking at the floor. I was protecting you," Jonathan said, and for the first time the warmth in his voice carried a faint strain, the sound of something held under tension for too long. "You were shrinking me," Victoria replied. "One thoughtful conversation at a time. And I kept thinking the problem was me." Silence. Clean and final. "You've been on our board for 2 years, Victoria continued, her voice shifting into the register she used when reading financial reports. Factual, precise, without room for negotiation. "During that time, you canceled 3 site visits, missed every volunteer event, and built the foundation for a dinner I never attended." A pause. "I'd like your resignation by Monday." Jonathan looked at Ethan once. Ethan was studying the tablecloth. He had picked up the yellow anchor button from where Victoria had left it and was turning it slowly between his fingers, entirely elsewhere. Jonathan left. The room exhaled. Victoria sat down hard, the way people do when the thing they've been bracing against suddenly disappears. Her eyes closed for 1 second. Her shoulders dropped slightly. The particular release of someone who had been holding the same position for so long she'd forgotten she was holding it. When she opened her eyes, she looked directly at Ethan. Not with the measured look she had used all evening. Not with the evaluating gaze of someone building a case. This was the look of a woman who had just set something down after carrying it for years. She reached across the table and touched the back of Ethan's hand. Just once. Just long enough for both of them to feel it before she pulled away. "That was very good, Mom," Emma said. "Don't celebrate yet," Victoria replied. But the edge had vanished from her voice. Completely vanished. Ethan set the button on the table between them. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know. He'll make things harder. Board politics. Probably." She looked at the button. "I've been in harder rooms." Ethan looked at it too. "You're sewing," Victoria said after a moment. "The ear on Noah's stuffed elephant. 3 times. Ethan looked up. "I read people," she said by way of explanation. "I do it for a living." "And what did you read?" Victoria considered the question. A man who fixes things carefully, more than once, without complaining about it. Ethan said nothing. Outside, somewhere beyond the chandeliers he had hung, beyond the laughter that had resumed its orbit, beyond the $5 bills still sitting on the corner table, the city continued moving at its regular speed. Trucks, lights, people heading home. Something had stopped there. Something had started. What it would become, neither of them could have told you yet. But Sophie had a folded story in her pocket. Victoria Bennett had a yellow anchor button in her clutch. And Ethan Walker, for the first time in 3 years, had forgotten about the cold tea. Later, after the last guests filtered out and venue staff began folding tablecloths in the distance, Ethan shrugged back into his maintenance jacket and zipped it to the collar. He picked up his name badge from the table where he had left it and held it for a moment before clipping it back on. He said goodbye to each girl by name. Emma, Grace, Charlotte, Sophie. Each one said goodnight back with the seriousness of children who understood that something real had happened and intended to treat it accordingly. He nodded once toward Victoria. She nodded back. Then he walked toward the service exit at the back of the hall, the door he always used, the one that opened onto the loading dock, the employee parking lot, and the particular quiet of a city at 11:30. Victoria stood in the lobby with the girls gathered around her waiting for the car. Her hand slipped into her clutch. Her thumb rested against the smooth, round shape of the button. She watched the service exit swing shut behind him. She was still standing there when the car arrived. The first time Ethan came to the house, he arrived on a Saturday morning carrying a canvas tool bag and a thermos of coffee because Victoria had mentioned once in a text message, One that was technically about the foundation's plumbing contract, that the kitchen door had been sticking for 2 months. The house was large. Ethan had known it would be, but knowing and standing inside it were different things. High ceilings, pale walls, the kind of space decorated by someone who understood proportion but not warmth. Everything was expensive. Everything was correct. Everything sat slightly too far apart. The furniture was arranged with enough room between pieces that you could move through the entire house without touching anything. Maybe that was the point. 4 pairs of shoes were piled beside the front door with absolutely no system. That was the first thing that made the place feel lived in. Victoria showed him to the kitchen and left him alone, which he appreciated. He didn't need an audience. He set his tool bag on the floor and crouched in front of the cabinet door. The hinge was the problem. One loose screw had backed out just enough to make the entire door drag against the frame. 3 minutes of work if you had the right screwdriver. Ethan had the right screwdriver. He tightened the screw, opened the cabinet, and closed it again. Smooth. Quiet. Then he moved to the next one. Different issue. Worn hinge pin. He tapped it back into place with a small hammer. 1 tap. Tfo. Then he held the door open and let it close on its own. Silent. He was working on the 3rd cabinet when he noticed the house had become quiet in a different way. Not empty quiet. Listening quiet. He looked over his shoulder. Sophie was standing in the kitchen doorway in her socks, watching him. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Fixing hinges," Ethan said. She stepped closer and crouched beside him with the effortless confidence children have before they learn they're supposed to ask permission first. "Why are they broken?" "They're not broken," Ethan replied. "Just loose. Things get loose over time. You tighten them and they're fine." Sophie looked at the screwdriver, then at the cabinet. "Can I try?" Ethan handed it over. He showed her where to place the tip. He held the cabinet steady while she turned it. Her small hand gripped the screwdriver with far more seriousness than the task required. The screw seated properly. "Good," Ethan said. Sophie handed it back and sat on the floor with her back against the cabinet, watching him work on the next one. She didn't say anything else. She just stayed. From somewhere deeper in the house, Ethan heard Emma and Grace arguing about something small and entirely unimportant. A moment later, Charlotte called out a single word that somehow settled the disagreement immediately. Then he heard Noah's voice, which meant Noah had migrated from the living room toward wherever the argument had been happening, because that was what Noah always did. And then, upstairs, footsteps stopped. Ethan couldn't see her, but Victoria was standing at the top of the staircase. He knew the particular feeling of someone going still above you. She had heard the hammer taps. She had heard cabinet doors closing one after another, each one quieter than the last. The house sounded different now. Not dramatically different, just settled. 1 year is a small phrase for how much can change. Noah was 6 now. He had strong opinions about breakfast, a best friend named Daniel, and a habit of narrating his life in the 3rd person, which Ethan had decided not to correct because, honestly, it was the funniest thing he had ever heard. The Ethan Walker Foundation for Single-Parent Families had a website Victoria stayed up until 2 in the morning designing herself, something she would absolutely deny if anyone asked. On the homepage was a photograph of a folded piece of paper. Not staged, real. Sophie had found it weeks after the gala tucked inside a jacket pocket and handed it to Victoria over breakfast one morning. Victoria had taken a picture before she even realized she was doing it. The foundation was still small. 7 partner organizations. A volunteer hotline operating 2 evenings a week. A monthly resource drop that had helped 43 families during its first 6 months. Small numbers. The kind that don't look impressive on a board report until you know whose names are attached to them. Ethan still worked mornings at the event center. He had been offered a promotion 3 different times and accepted the 3rd one because Noah needed health insurance and because there was nothing wrong with a man understanding the value of a steady wrench in a difficult world. Every Tuesday evening, he drove to a rented community room 2 blocks from the center and sat in a circle with 7 other single fathers who were all trying, in their own ways, to figure out what it meant to be enough. He didn't run the group. He simply showed up. That turned out to be the whole thing. Showing up was the whole thing. Some evenings Victoria would stand in the kitchen doorway and watch Ethan help Emma with math homework while Noah sat on his lap, paying absolutely no attention to the math itself, simply leaning back against Ethan's chest with both arms hanging loosely at his sides. Victoria never said anything during those moments. She simply smiled. The real smile. The one that reached her eyes. Sophie had started drawing more. Charlotte had started a rock collection organized by weight. Grace carried a library card, the way explorers carry passports. Emma was quietly building a case for an argument she claimed she hadn't finished yet. Victoria had stopped touching her left wrist whenever she felt nervous. She had started doing something else instead. One evening, while standing in that kitchen doorway watching Ethan read aloud to all 5 children at once, the 4 girls and Noah, who had fallen asleep with his head resting on Sophie's knee, she realized her hand was resting flat against her sternum. Steady, present. As if she were checking to make sure something was still there. It was. Some things you lose. Some things you find in the corner of a room where the tea has gone cold, and 4 6-year-old girls decide, after 11 minutes of observation, that you are exactly the right person for the job, not because you're perfect, because you're present, not because you have the right clothes, the right title, or the right way of entering a room, because you stay. Noah woke up, blinked around the room, and announced in his third-person voice, Noah isn't exactly sure where Noah is, but Noah is okay. Ethan laughed softly. Yeah, buddy, me too. Sophie laughed. Then Emma did. Then Grace. Then Charlotte. And the room, this small, ordinary room with mismatched chairs, homework spread across the table, and a rock collection sitting on the windowsill, held something the Sterling Event Center, with all its chandeliers, polished speeches, and carefully calibrated laughter, had never managed to contain. It held people who had decided to stay. The yellow anchor button remained in Victoria's clutch for 11 months. Then one day Emma decided it belonged on the wall. She framed it beside the $5 bills and hung it in the living room, where everyone could see it. Every night when the house grew quiet, and the last lamp switched off, neither Ethan nor Victoria needed to explain what it meant. They already knew. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people, this story was for you. Share it with someone who might need it today. There are more stories out there, more people you haven't met yet, more rooms you haven't walked into. We'll see you there.